Divas, what do you know about the death penalty in Florida? Well, I guarantee you're going to know a lot more about it at the end of this episode than you did when you tuned in, because today's special guest is Maria DeLiberato. She is the executive director of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. We will talk about how death warrants are signed, the number of exonerations from death row in Florida, why she thinks the death penalty should be done away with in favor of life in prison without parole, and much more. Stick with us. Maria DeLiberato, Executive Director of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty.
I like to sort of talk about the collateral damage of the death penalty that is well beyond sort of the execution and what happens. It's all of that. It's the people who witness. It's the family members of the condemned. It's the family members of the victims. It's the corrections officers. It's the people that have to do the things and put him on the gurney and put the needle in his arm and all those things. Like that collective damage that we are doing that ripples out is so devastating.
You're listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida. Let's dive in.
Divas, welcome back. Today's special guest. I'm really excited to have her with us this week. Maria DeLiberato. She is also one of my OGs. Sorry to say, guys, I just keep having them. She is the executive director of the Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. I think I got that right. Did I get that right?
That's right.
Welcome to a deeper dive, Maria.
Thanks for having me.
Can you describe a little bit of what your job is and how you got interested in representing people who've been sentenced to death?
Sure. So I've been a lawyer 21 years now. I actually started my career as a prosecutor in Miami-Dade County. So I went to law school in Pennsylvania. I worked in the district attorney's office there. And then I was an assistant state attorney for 3 years in Miami. And then I moved to Tampa in 2006 and was looking for work and came upon Capital Collateral Regional Counsel, which is a state agency that represents people already convicted and sentenced to death in their collateral appeals. And so I kind of went from, being a prosecutor to representing people already on death row and, got a little bit of grief, of course, from, some of my prosecutor friends. And I was like, listen, for the most part, I've always been anti-death penalty. I was raised Catholic. It wasn't ever something that was acceptable sort of in my household growing up. So that was not, unusual for me. And I was like, look, as a prosecutor, I was trying to put people away for life. And as a capital defense lawyer, I'm just trying to get rid of the death penalty, right? I'm just trying to say that life without the possibility of parole is the appropriate alternative. And so I kind of fell into the work and it really got me in so many ways, in large part because of my representation of Clemente Aguirre, who of course is one of Florida's death row exonerees. I represented him for 10 years until we got him out after DNA proved his innocence. And he spent 14 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. And so then it became a lot more than, well, I'm against the death penalty and I want people to get life, is an alternative to actually we are convicting and sentencing innocent people to death. And of course, as you know, Florida leads the nation in death row exoneration. So I did that work for 13 years at CCRC. I left there in 2019 and I joined the public defender's office in Pinellas County as a part-time public defender, where I still work today as a part-time public defender there, doing capital cases and first-degree murder cases at the trial level. And I also do a lot of our appeals and sort of special projects in that context. And then 2 years ago, I joined Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. They were looking for an executive director, and it was sort of a, as these things go, kind of a happenstance. Mark Elliott was the former director who I knew.
I've known him for many years.
And when Clemente was released, he was released in 2018 and he moved to Tampa. I live in Tampa. He lived like 5 minutes away from me. It was super surreal, still is. He comes to my house for Christmas every year.
Wow.
But Mark and Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty stepped in and helped him so much. These exonerees have nothing, right? They don't have any means. And of course, Clemente had his own issues because of immigration and things like that. So he wasn't able to work. And Mark was able to get him connected and get him some speaking engagements and honorariums and things like that. And I was just really impressed with the group as a whole. And I started to consult with them a little bit on stuff. Like they would always ask for the lawyers to, check in, weigh in. I consulted on some lethal injection public records requests and things like that. And so they came looking, they got a pretty generous gift from a donor, and they really wanted a paid executive director. Mark was a volunteer forever, ever, ever. And they really wanted to take FADP kind of to the next level. And it's sort of like we're in a group chat, and Allison Miller, who's a longtime capital defense lawyer, she was like, hey, I'm supposed to help find a new executive director for FADP. Anybody interested? And I was like, I'll do it. Like just sort of in a kind of offhand. And they were like, what, really? And I was like, I love being a lawyer. I love being a litigator. And there are definitely times where you feel like, I always felt like we could end the death penalty in the court system because like it's so underused. It's so arbitrary when you think about the Eighth Amendment and all of that. And then of course, the makeup of our US Supreme Court now is very different than it was, even back in 2016. And so it kind of came like, if we can't do this in the court, we're going to have to do this with the people. We're going to have to do this with the legislature. We're going to have to explain to Floridians that we don't need a death penalty to be safer, that we can be strong and protect our communities and keep people safe without the use of the death penalty. And so it was sort of a bit of a perfect storm. And I ended up applying for and getting the executive director position in July of 22. So this is my second full year. And of course, at the time, right, Florida had not had an execution since 2019.
Right.
And I think 6 months in, we had the two most extreme death penalty bills in the nation and an execution set. And I was like, well, I'm doing swimmingly as executive director of this anti-death penalty
Well, I don't think that was your fault. I mean, I think that the reason that we had that law was there was one reason for that, and that was Nicholas Cruz. So what you're referring to is the change. We've gone through a number of changes with the death penalty in Florida because of U.S. Supreme Court rulings and Florida Supreme Court rulings. Then we saw a new Florida Supreme Court. It's like, unanimous, not unanimous. It's these Hearst cases are quite complicated. I don't want to really get into all the nitty gritty of that. But the upshot is that now Florida has one of the most, I'm not sure what the word, lenient or the easiest.
I call it extreme. I mean, it's the most extreme in the nation.
We went from requiring unanimity for the death penalty recommendations from juries to now it's 8-4, and 8-4 can convict. And I think there are just a handful of states that don't require. You tell me how many.
Yeah. So just Alabama allows non-unanimity in the sentencing, and that's 10-2. They require 10. Delaware had been, there were some other states that had been, but they no longer have the death penalty. So in terms of active states, there's one other state that has a bit of a hybrid situation, but only Alabama allows for non-unanimity, and they require 10. So Florida is in the company of Alabama, and then they even have a lower threshold than Alabama. And what's sort of worse, it's not going from unanimity to non-unanimity. Also, it went from a verdict back to a recommendation. Of course, very briefly, before Hearst, everything was non-unanimous and it was a recommendation. 7-5 could do it. After Hearst, the U.S. Supreme Court said you can't do that. It has to be unanimous. So unanimous findings and unanimous verdict. The judge couldn't override either way. If it was death, the judge could still override to life, but couldn't override. But the jury's verdict was final. And now we are back to a recommendation and 8 votes. They did at least, the small miracle, not bring back override. So 5 members of the jury vote for life, 5 or more, it has to be life.
I mean, I think that's how they got in trouble the first time with Hearst, wasn't it? It was like the judges had too much power.
When they passed this bill, I spent hours in the legislature, and I just, I kept asking, like, can we just have an honest conversation? This is going to be reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court. Like, there's no question about it. It's going to be reversed. It's a matter of when. Now, it took 14 years between Ring and Hearst for them to take it, right?
I'm waiting for the case, Maria. Where's the case?
It's coming. It's coming.
I'm looking. I've got all these death penalty. I have all these tabs. I'm looking at my browser right now. I've got all these tabs open with death sentence cases that I'm watching at the Florida Supreme Court, thinking this is going to be the case. It's going to be the Michael Jackson case. No, it's going to be this case. It's going to be that case. Like, which is going to be the case?
It's hard to say, and the Supreme Court, what we know, right, is they will wait to take the case that they think is most appropriate and suitable to address it.
Right.
I've had honest conversations with prosecutors in the Pinellas County Justice Center who know, right? They know that this is coming back. They know that it's coming back because Hearst was 8-1. It wasn't some 5-4 liberal conservative split.
Right.
It's coming back on unanimity. There's no question about it. So it's all a waste and it's cruel because all these legislators that passed this and the Governor DeSantis signing this, like they're going to be long gone by the time this comes back. But you know who's not long gone is the victims' family members, the clients' family members who one day are going to be like, by the way, your death sentence is overturned and now we got to do this all over again.
And which what we're doing with these post-Hearst resentencings, it's created a lot of confusion and a lot of extra litigation, changing the law. I mean, because like I said, we went through a lot of changes. We changed it. I can't remember the exact number of years, but it was just a handful of years. We went from 7 to 5, right?
Well, it was actually 10-2 for like 5 minutes.
Right. Right.
And then the Florida Supreme Court said, no, it has to be unanimous.
Right.
And then it was 12-0. So it was 12-0 from 2017 until 2023. So 6 years of
But
unanimity.
in the meantime, they were doing all these resentencings from Hearst. And again, this is a little complicated for people, so just bear with us. But we had a lot of changes in a short period of time, caused a lot of litigation, a lot of confusion. Now we're back to where we were sort of post-Hearst, like, okay, we should be resentenced under the unanimity because that was what was in place when the resentencing was ordered. But there's a question now of should we be tried under unanimity or should we be tried? So these cases are churning their way upward to the Supreme Court too.
Again, more chaos, more uncertainty for not just, of course, the folks facing the death penalty, but for the families of the victims. I mean, Michael Jackson's case is a perfect example. There's 3 co-defendants, 3 different results, right? One was resentenced under unanimity and got a life recommendation. Michael Jackson, of course, was sentenced under non-unanimity, got an 8-4, the barest majority for death. And then Tiffany Cole was tried under non-unanimity and got a unanimous life recommendation, right? Now, arguably, she's the least culpable, and depending on how you sort of look at that, but in terms of the actual committing of the crime. So that case in particular just highlights, like, could you have a more arbitrary system than 1 murder, 3 defendants, 3 different results?
I mean, it was a horrible crime. Let's make clear that was a very horrible crime. An elderly couple buried alive.
Unfathomably horrible.
Right.
And we spend a lot of time at FADP talking to murder victim family members. We spend a lot of time listening and hearing what they have to say. And I get it. I understand the desire for the death penalty. I really, truly do. I've sat with victims. What happens, though, is the uncertainty. And I never like to use the word closure because they don't get closure no matter what. They don't get closure with a death sentence or a life sentence.
I don't believe there is such a thing as closure, but anyway.
Me neither.
Okay.
Me neither. But what happens is like at least the process stops. I pled a case in Pinellas a couple of weeks ago. It was a death penalty on the table. We pled to consecutive life sentences. The client wanted it. He was incredibly remorseful. He was under the influence of drugs when the murders happened. And he was like, I want this to be over. I want this to be over for my family, for their family. And we stood in court and like everybody was, super emotional, and it's over now. He doesn't have 10 years and 15 years of appeals. The back to that is, well, we should just speed up the process. We can't do that. We can't do that because of the number of innocent people that we have sent to death in Florida. So it's like, for me, the death penalty, the problem is I get the desire for it. And some of these crimes are just so unimaginably horrific, but it's never over. It's never over. With Michael Jackson's death sentence, this case is going to be litigated for another 10 to 15 years.
And we'll be right back with Maria DeLiberato.
At Tampa Electric, we're proud to provide 99.9% service reliability in blue skies and gray. We're modernizing our grid to increase resilience for the families and businesses that depend on us every day. Year-round, we harden our system against extreme weather by burying power lines, maintaining line clearance, improving substations, and upgrading systems to restore power faster. Because the work we do now means reliable power for a bright future. Learn more at tampaelectric.com/reliability.
And we're back with Maria DeLiberato, Executive Director of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. you've met with victims' families. Have any of them said to you, I don't want the death penalty pursued in this case? And how often do prosecutors, will they take that into account when they're trying capital cases?
Not as often as I would like them to. Sometimes they will take that into consideration. I think some state attorney's offices do a better job than others at that. What usually happens though, and this was sort of evident in Parkland, right, is if there's multiple victims or multiple family members, there's sometimes dissension in the family.
Right.
People become prosecutors because they want to do what they think is justice. They want to do the right thing. They're not out there just desiring to become prosecutors to kill a bunch of people. I don't believe that. I don't think that's what's happening. Their default is, well, we'll just do death because we don't want to upset the people that don't. My frustration and what I've expressed to the prosecutors that I work with, I don't think you explain the process to them in the right way and in a complete and honest way. And that's what I try to do as a defense attorney.
You mean tell them that this person could end up on death row for 30 years and there will be many, many court hearings and court cases?
Yeah.
That's what you're looking at.
It also then has to be about the person that we're killing, because the law says, of course, that we're only supposed to kill the most aggravated. And
I see what you're saying. It takes the focus away from the victim.
And I say that I say that to my friends and family, if somebody ever murders me, please don't let them seek the death penalty. I want the story to be about me and the life that I have, the legacy that I've created, not about what sad, terrible things happen to them. Because let me be clear, I have represented more than 30 men on Florida's death row, and not a single one of them had a happy, healthy, well-adjusted, safe childhood that you would want a child that you cared about to spend even 5 minutes in, right? I mean, we can talk about Mr. Cole's execution, which is coming up. I mean, horrific crime, of course, and horrifically abused, traumatized child. You can't separate that. And the death penalty makes that to the forefront. And as someone in the victim's family member, I could be frustrated by that. Why aren't you talking about my loved one? I lost someone. I want to talk about them. But because the way the law is, it has to shift that way. So with life in prison, I met a couple whose daughter was murdered in Pennsylvania, and they were adamant against the death penalty. They were raised Catholic. And they're for the last 30 years, we've been able to talk about her. We've been able to have a foundation in her name. We've been able to do all these things. We don't even have to give the person who took her life a second thought.
As somebody who's been writing about this and writes about this a lot, and one of the reasons that I thought of having you on the podcast now is because we do have an active warrant. And I think this episode is scheduled to come out just days before the scheduled August 29th execution of Lorian Cole. You mentioned his horrible childhood, this horrible crime. As somebody who writes very frequently about the death penalty, I always do try to put enough information about the victims into the stories so that I am recognizing them as victims. But oftentimes I'm writing about very arcane legal maneuvering, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but it's a very complicated area of law, and trying to make it understandable for people. Why am I reading about this guy again? I will tell you, just reading the cases is difficult, let alone witnessing multiple executions. I told my people, I really don't want to do that anymore. It really is a very, I don't even know a word for it, but it messes with my head for days, if not weeks afterwards.
I like to sort of talk about the collateral damage of the death penalty that is well beyond sort of the execution and what happens. It's all of that. It's the people who witness. It's the family members of the condemned. It's the family members of the victims. It's the corrections officers. It's the people that have to do the things and put him on the gurney and put the needle in his arm and all those things. That collective damage that we are doing that ripples out is so devastating. And I see it. I've been doing this 21 years now, all through the criminal justice system. I see it in myself. I see it amongst my colleagues, judges, all of it. We have a perspective on the world that I wish I didn't have in a lot of ways. And so to me, just ending the death penalty, just taking executions off the table does so much to ameliorate some of that harm.
You mentioned, I think you included this in one of your blog posts or your messages that you send to your members or your supporters. We had Governor Bush on recently, and he had a lot going on with the death penalty under his watch. I think is when we had a botched execution. I hate to use that word
Angel
because
Diaz,
I feel it trivializes in a way.
It was torture for 37 minutes.
It was the electric chair.
Angel Diaz was the
lethal injection. I'm sorry.
There was previous botched executions with the electric chair, which is why they switched to lethal injection, because several men had caught on fire.
I'm sorry.
Florida has a tortured history.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's hard to keep track.
Yeah.
Florida has a tortured history in terms of conducting executions.
And so we switched to lethal injection, but I was looking up the protocol as I was preparing for you because I've written about the lethal injection protocol. They've changed it over the years. I don't know what they're doing with the drugs. There's so much secrecy around the drugs, but I noticed that there still is a protocol for execution by electrocution. Is that still an option?
So it is still an option. Basically, after someone is convicted and sentenced to death and their conviction is final, so meaning they've been through their direct appeal, it's lethal injection unless they affirmatively elect electrocution, and they have to do it within like 60 days of their case being final. I think that there may be one person on Florida's death row who has elected electrocution, or he did in the past, but I don't know if that's still accurate. There has not been an electrocution since 2000 or 2001. The person that had elected it, and that's just my memory, is nowhere near the end stage of his appeals yet. So it wouldn't be an issue, but it is still a legal, lawful method. Now, I can tell you that if an electrocution was set, there would be a lot of litigation around it, because what was happening, of course, is the reason they switched to lethal injection is it was at the U.S. Supreme Court after the third consecutive execution by electrocution where somebody had caught fire. The U.S. Supreme Court was about to say, hey, Florida can't do this anymore. And then they switched to lethal injection.
Right. And you have litigated quite a bit about the use of lethal injection. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's been a while since I've been involved in that litigation, but we did do it for quite some time. And the basic argument is Florida's protocol, the 3-drug protocol, is incredibly problematic because the first drug, which is now etomidate, if it doesn't properly render someone insensate, the second 2 drugs are incredibly painful. Well, the paralytic and then the potassium chloride. And the problem that we're seeing with the etomidate, which we also saw with the pentobarbital, is it actually causes death by suffocation. It fills the lungs with fluid, so the person is sort of drowning. This mechanism for death is supposed to be the potassium chloride to the heart, but the person is very likely suffocating, suffering, but the paralytic prevents that from being seen. So we know from the autopsies, from the etomidate executions, and from even the ones previous, that the lungs are filled, pulmonary edema, the lungs are just filled with frothy fluid, which indicates that the person is sort of suffocating to death. The litigation on the other side, I always like to be sort of, right, I'm being candid about what it is. They're saying that might be happening, but the person is insensate when that's happening and they're unaware. That's really the crux
So it's
of it.
not unconstitutional.
That's their response.
Right.
Our response and our expert response is, of course, the opposite, but it's all could be resolved, right? We know plenty of us have had the unfortunate experience of having our pets have to be put down. The AMVA, the American Medical Veterinary Association, does not allow a paralytic in an animal euthanasia, and we are killing human beings with it. So if you really want to know the truth, Florida, about what's happening, and other states who do this 3-drug protocol, take away the paralytic and we'll see. And that's been part of the crux of the fight, and they won't do that. So to me, it's like there's science supporting our argument, and the state has science that they believe is supporting their argument. And it's a little bit difficult to prove, right? We can't ask the person, are you feeling this?
Right.
We know from anesthesia awareness and things like that, but you could eliminate this problem by eliminating the paralytic and at least having some more honest and open conversation about it.
Well, I mentioned finishing up with Governor Bush. I mentioned him because he has said things like this in the past, but I felt like he was very honest when I asked him if he had any regrets about something that he wanted to do or didn't do or would have done differently. And he brought up the death penalty. And, he didn't say that he would want to do away with it, but he did say that it's not a deterrent. I was trying to get a sense of if that was what his meaning was. And, one of my ex-husbands accused me of being so busy reading between the lines that I didn't read the lines. So I was trying not to do that with the governor. But he said it's not a deterrent. It's really expensive. And he also said that he thinks it should be unanimous, which I thought those were interesting comments, the recognition of those 3 things.
I think that's all true. And, what I've said as my role as executive director, and what I say when I meet with the legislators is like, I just want to have an honest conversation. I want you to understand the realities of the system. It sounds great on a podium to say like, this crime is horrible. It deserves the death penalty. I get that. That sounds nice politically. But what you're not understanding is all the damage that you're doing. And what you can do briefly, quickly, is resolve these cases in a much different way that's more cost effective, that brings better healing for everyone and stops this dragged out process.
To be completely fair, I have to say the governor also said, it takes too long. The families are hanging out there for a long time. So I wasn't sure if he would have wanted to do like a speedier thing. Like they did pass that. I think it was under Joe
The Timely
Negron.
Justice Act.
Yeah.
It was, Governor Scott signed that.
Yes.
I mean, again, I was on a panel a couple of years ago with some Parkland parents of some Parkland victims. And it was just, heartbreaking, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And I talked to one of them and he was like, look, I get it that we need to have an appeals process. Like, I understand that we get it wrong. That was refreshing to hear, because it does have to be that way. And I wish it were true, right? People are like, okay, well, that doesn't happen anymore because, DNA. Clemente's case went to trial in 2006. There was DNA. They just didn't test it. His lawyers did a terrible job.
There's still cases where they're not testing DNA, right?
Right. It's not like this is a thing of the past. And so we can't come to a place where we okay, let's just shorten the appeals. That's not the answer.
The feeling in the legislature is, because I spend a lot more time with those guys than you do on a regular basis. And the feeling that I get from them, even with Democrats, is we can't touch this because Floridians are so wed to having the death penalty. I feel like some of the people I know, their attitudes towards the death penalty have evolved over time. They mature. There are these outlier cases with people mention Ted Bundy and Danny Rolling and the Parkland horrific massacre there. But I think the more people learn about the inequities that are in the system, the people who've been found to be innocent, those things, once you become more aware of those, some people then also think it may be bigger punishment to have you live out your life. And Florida prisons are no picnic.
Yeah. I think all that's true. And I found that frustration because I don't think that Floridians want the death penalty any more than others. I think that that's a convenient way for the legislatures and our representatives to be like, no, my people want it. And that is honestly my number one job and goal as the executive director, is to get the people that are on the ground that I know don't want this to tell their representatives that, so that they feel comfortable, so that they have the cover, so they can go in and say, look, I talked to my constituents and they don't want that. And here's why. And I think that that is something that I need to do, what we're working on at FADP, but it's also what's apparent is when you look at juries, right? We do jury selection in capital cases. In a capital jury, you can't be on the death penalty if you would always vote for the death penalty or if you would never vote for the death penalty, right? The law says if you give it in every case, you're not allowed to be on it. If you never give it ever, you're not allowed to be on the jury. So everybody else is kind of in the middle. And we talk to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. It's 50, 45, 55 in favor of life without parole. There's a flip when you say life without parole versus just life, right? People are scared. Are they going to get out? Right? And I get that. And that's just not true. There's no parole in Florida and there hasn't been in a very long time. So I do push back with the legislators that that's not what Floridians want. And that's my job. And that's something we're working on at FADP. But when I talk to people and I just see it, and you see it in the jury votes, when you talk about 8-4, right? That's okay. I'm bad at math. I went to law school, but that's not overwhelming majority for the death penalty.
Right.
When you're looking at these non-unanimous cases, we're talking about a slight preference, maybe, if that. It's not an overwhelming preference.
There is a death warrant. We have not had any death warrants for about, 8 months?
Since last October, I believe, was the last execution.
Is there any consistency or pattern of how death warrants are signed? Is it like the most egregious cases? How do governors pick who's chosen for death?
I have lots of theories and thoughts over the years just from sort of anecdotally and watching it, but no. And that's really the problem. Part of the problem is, again, it sort of compounds that secrecy. And Florida, unlike some other states have a process where the prosecutor will ask the court to set a date, and there's sort of these mechanisms in place. Florida is completely random. The governor has sole discretion when and if to sign a death warrant. And that is unusual. And for one person to have that much sort of unfettered power and not have to explain why is kind of terrifying.
Wait, how do they do it in other states?
In some states, the attorney general moves the court to set an execution date, and they set them months. They can set them months out, or some states like Ohio, I think, sets them years out. It's like a process, right? And then they go through the court. Here, it's like you get your full round of appeals and then you're in clemency, and you can be in clemency for 2 months or 10 years. There's no like limit to it. The governor denies clemency as he signs the warrant. That's what happens. And that's really what the Timely Justice Act essentially tried to do. They tried to speed up the process of clemency, and it didn't fully work, in part because it's just really difficult to do. There's so many men on Florida's death row, and Florida has been doing this lately. I mean, the warrant period is 30 days.
It's a short amount of time.
Yeah. I mean, I think, of course, Marty McLean, one of the best capital defense lawyers in our state.
Yes.
May he rest in peace.
Yes, rest in peace, Marty.
He, I think, litigated that once. I think he had one that was like 24 days or 26 days or something. He had one of the shortest warrant periods. I've been through two, and it's just, as a lawyer, and it's unbelievable the amount of things that are supposed to happen. It really is kind of a sham proceeding by that point.
I was just looking online to try to find out how many men are on death row right now, and I'm not finding it. Do you know?
It's like right around 300, and there's, I think, 1 or 2 women. But
I was trying to find it. Instead, I found this. The Department of Corrections has this kind of odd page with kind of like factoids about the executions in Florida. Have you seen that page?
Yeah, there's like,
I don't know. It's a little creep show.
There's like the death row page with the executions and all the stats and stuff like that.
The executioner is a private citizen who is paid $150 per execution.
Yeah. So 279 total
Thank you.
now as of today. 171 white males, 95 black males, 11 other males, 0 white females, 2 black females, 0 other females. So 279 total.
Okay. Well, thank you for looking that up for me and sharing that with our listeners. When you were a prosecutor, did you ever seek death in any of the cases you...
No. So interestingly, when I applied to be an assistant state attorney, that was a question that they asked. And I said, I'm not comfortable seeking the death penalty. I'm against the death penalty. I'm Catholic. I don't believe in the death penalty. Obviously, I respect that that's the law, but it's not something I want to participate in. Is that going to like impair and impact my like ability to move upward in this office? And at the time, the answer was no, absolutely not. We have prosecutors who want to do it and don't. And I was there for 3 years. I ended up in the career criminal unit. I was prosecuting serious criminal cases, murders, robberies, things like that. I didn't feel in any way that like my desire not to do that impacted me in any way. And the judges get to choose too. They don't have to be death qualified, but they can't have any death cases if they're not death qualified.
Oh, I see. Right.
Over my years of doing this, I think maybe there was like one judge who just didn't get death qualified, and there would never be a death penalty case. I could never be a juror on a capital case because I can't follow the law. I appreciate that that's the law, but I don't believe in the death penalty. And I would never impose the death penalty under any circumstances because of my beliefs. And so that means I couldn't be on a jury, and I couldn't be a judge. If I was going to be a judge, I would have to be a judge who doesn't do death penalty cases. I would honestly say I would never impose the death penalty, and that's not the law. I want Floridians to understand that we don't need the death penalty, that it doesn't have a deterrent effect. I mean, all the things that Governor Bush said about the death penalty, he's absolutely right about. The facts supporting it, where he comes down on it and whether he thinks that it should be abolished or not, that's, it's sort of neither here nor there. He's identifying the issues. And quite frankly, that's where we have to start. And that's my goal is like, let's have an honest conversation about this.
But instead of backing away from the death penalty, not only did they shrink the number of jurors necessary for a death recommendation, lawmakers last year passed a law allowing the death penalty for people convicted of sexual crimes against children under the age of 12. Are you aware of any active cases where the state is seeking death under those circumstances?
I'm not. I know there was one, and that resolved in a life plea. I think that was in the Fifth Circuit. I feel like there might be another one somewhere up in the Panhandle that's pending. I know in my circuit, in the Sixth Circuit, there aren't any pending because that law, unlike the unanimity law about the effective date, they did that one at least correct. I mean, obviously I disagree with the law, but the way they did the effective date is so much cleaner because they did the effective date as crimes that occurred on or before October 1st.
Yes, which
right?
they could have done very easily with the unanimity. Right.
They didn't want to. And now we're in this sort of chaotic, all arbitrary system. But no, so it'll be a while, even if, these death penalty cases, that's another problem, right? They cost a lot more money. They take a lot longer to go to trial. There's a lot more discovery that has to happen. So, I mean, even if, one happened in October of 23, like on the day that it became eligible, we're talking about a trial that wouldn't happen, late this year, early next year at the earliest, assuming one there. So we're still years away from that kind of litigation, I think.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about Clemente and how you were able to get his death, somebody off of death row? I mean, that's quite a stunning achievement.
Yeah, sure. So I represented him when I was at CCRC. Of course, he came to our office then. 2009 is when I got his case, and we looked at it. And of course,
it's
no
kind
DNA
of like the public defender for death cases.
Exactly right. Yep. Yeah.
CCRC, and there's 3 different divisions in different parts of the state. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but people might not know.
Yep. And it's only appeals. So they're already convicted, sentenced to death, and had their direct appeal affirmed.
Right.
So we do post-conviction. So we got the case. No DNA testing had ever been done, except for just like a few things that the state wanted. His lawyers did not believe him. They did no investigation. I mean, some of the worst lawyering that I have ever seen. I've said that multiple times, and I will always say it. So it's true. Literally some of the worst lawyering I've ever seen, unfortunately. And so we consulted with the Innocence Project. I very much believed in his innocence right away. It just didn't add up. He didn't have a single prior. Like, I went to Honduras. I interviewed hundreds of members of his family. Usually when you do this work, there's some sort of like mitigation history, right? There's a traumatic childhood. There's violence. There's things that say, okay, I can understand how this person stabbed a woman 129 times. The victim in his case was stabbed 129 times. And he lived next door to them. Like, there was no history, none of that. And so we were able to do DNA testing in consultation with the Innocence Project. We tested, I think, 150 blood stains in the apartment. It was a stabbing. It was a trailer, and 8 drops of blood belonging to the daughter of the victims. It was a mother and a grandmother that were killed. Her blood was at the crime scene, and none of Clemente's blood, of course. And it was in areas where the state had argued that Clemente, as the killer, cleaned up, right? So it was in the bathroom.
Right.
And her blood was inches away from the victim's blood because she's dripping, because she gets cut from the knife. She's dripping as she's walking through the trailer. Like, crystal clear cut case of like, this is what happens when you stab somebody. That's how your blood gets there. And I was like, this is great. I mean, I remember when the DNA came back, it was 2012. And I'm like, we're done. This is great. No, 6 years later, until they finally dropped the charges, they fought tooth and nail every step of the way, including hiding for a couple of years. We didn't get it till 2012, a Baker Act where the daughter had said, demons in my head made me kill my family.
Mm.
She had admitted to the murders. She admitted to multiple people of the murders. They still weren't, we met with the state attorney. Like, it was unfathomable that they wouldn't agree. So we did a hearing and we lost the hearing. Jessica Rex-Ziegler in Seminole County denied the motion for new trial. It was in an inexplicable order. I mean, it was just the most absurd thing I've ever read. And it was unanimously reversed by the Florida Supreme Court, which doesn't, enough over the years of the Florida Supreme Court. They don't unanimously agree on anything. Very rarely.
Even back then.
And even back then, and they said, I mean, it's Justice Kennedy. I mean, it wasn't the court it is now,
right.
But it was,
right.
It was not, it was a fairly conservative leaning court anyway, unanimously said, basically they said, he deserves a new trial. And of course the daughter had testified against him at trial and like made up some story that how he had come in and like stood over her bed once or something, like just to make him sound creepy. And the language in the opinion said is like, no longer is Clemente the shadowy figure that comes into the house. He's a scapegoat for her crime.
Wow.
Like, that's what they said. And
very strong
the
language.
Day it came
I
out,
can't
like,
imagine that you must have gotten chills when you.
Right. And we're like, this is it. They're going to release him.
Right.
That same day, they were like, we're going forward. And they were seeking the death penalty.
Wow.
And so 2 more years until finally their case fell apart during jury selection when her alibi, who was her boyfriend, finally we figured out that he had lied. I mean, we knew he was lying, but we were able to prove it. His ex-wife, they had a bunch of jail calls that they had recorded. And he was like, I'm a liar. I lied all the time. I lied about all these things. And he had told her that he lied about the alibi and that Samantha went out the window that night. And so we were able, and then the state's case just fell apart, and they announced a null pros on November 5th, 2018.
So he spent 13 years?
14 years
14
in
years.
Total, 10 of them on death row.
Wow. Well, that's just one case of someone who was exonerated. How many exonerees do we have?
30. Herman Lindsay is, of course, one of our board members. Clemente is on our board at FADP, and so is Herman Lindsay and Ron Wright. So we have 3 of Florida's exonerees on our board.
We'll have to get one of them on the podcast someday.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that you'd like to share with our listeners before I ask you a more lighthearted question?
I want people to know the truth, right? I want people to understand the truth about Florida's death penalty, and I want to have conversation. So I'm not just interested in talking to people who agree with me, right? I don't want an echo chamber. I want to hear from people who are like, okay, but what about this? And what about that? And how do you propose we address this? So I really encourage people to, come to our website, to join our newsletter, to get updates, and to engage in this conversation with us, to come to our events. And if you are opposed to the death penalty already and you want to support and sign the petitions and do all those things, we welcome that. But I don't want people to think that it's just, this is not just an organization for people who agree with me. We're not going to change people's minds unless we start a real conversation. So I want people who are in favor of the death penalty, and I want to understand why. And I want people who are in the middle and on the fence, and where is their hesitation? And then, of course, I want the folks that are already with me, but those people are with me. So I'm trying to reach the people that are like, I'm thinking about this, but what about? I answer all my emails. So send me an email.
I'm sending you emails all the time, Maria. You know that. So you don't she means you all. She means all the other divas. Yeah.
All of the listeners know how to get in touch with me. But that's what I want. I want this to be a statewide conversation about the truth. You can find
Maria at the Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty's website. Before we say goodbye, this is really heavy stuff that you're dealing with on a regular basis and have been for a long time. So whether it's litigation or advocacy, still very heavy. What do you do to decompress?
I teach yoga and I practice yoga, and I also like to climb giant mountains. So I've climbed Kilimanjaro, I've climbed a mountain in Ecuador, and I'm climbing a very large mountain in South America in January.
Oh, you are? What is that?
Aconcagua. It is the highest mountain in South America.
How high?
22,000 feet.
Oh my gosh.
22,000 feet.
I don't think I can even be at 22,000 feet, let alone climb.
It's tough. I was on Kilimanjaro when the Dilbeck warrant was signed. I came off the mountain, turned on my phone, and I was like, non-unanimity and the warrant. And I was like, I'm going back on the mountain. It was not the finest moment. So I take a lot of breaks. I've got 2 dogs that I love and a wonderful partner, and we travel together a lot. And yoga keeps me from needing my own representation, and keeps me able to do this very important and very challenging work.
Well, Maria DeLiberato, Executive Director of the Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me and for having this conversation.
That was great.
Thanks for listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida, hosted by News Service senior writer Dara Cam and produced by me, Mike Exline. Music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs, LLC. To tell us what you like to hear, what you've thought about the podcast so far, or even just to mention how awesome we are, we have a new email address and we'd love to hear from you.
That's right. We'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcasts@e.newsserviceflorida.com. I know it's a mouthful, but it's podcasts@e.newsserviceflorida.com.